In the early 20th century, behaviorism introduced a theory of learning that was empirical, observable, and measurable. It resulted in evidence that animal and human behavior are learned through interactions of our environment. The two major types of conditioning are classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning was introduced by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who is recognized as the founder of the behaviorist learning theory. His experiments included dogs during feeding time, bells, and salivation. Pavlov proved that behavior could become a reflex response to a stimulus. Operant conditioning was introduced by American psychologist B.F. Skinner. He emphasized the use of positive and negative reinforcement to teach new behavior. His results concluded that rewarding small acts can condition complex forms of behavior.
Behaviorist pedagogy aims to promote and modify observable behavior. It demonstrates acquisition of knowledge or skills. In order to understand it, we look at three techniques and models: reward and punishment, behavioral instructional design, and taxonomies of learning. Behavioral instructional design emphasizes a predictable change in student behavior. With the right set of instructional stimuli, all manners of learning outcomes can be attained. It also emphasizes the practice and reinforcement seen in military training during World War II, which became a major component to the behaviorist developed instructional design model.
In 1926, Sidney Pressey introduced one of the earliest forms of the teaching machine. An image of this device, which looks similar to a typewriter, can be found on page 44 of the Harasim book. Pressey stated that the procedures and mastery of drill and informational material were in many instances simple and definite enough to permit handling of much routine teaching by mechanical means. Pressey's machine prompted the student with a question that had 4 possible answers. The student would select their answer choice and then be prompted with the next question. Once all questions had been answered, the person scoring the test would run the test sheet back through the device and it would display the score. This is very similar to the Scantron machines that are still widely used in K-12 and higher education today. In the 1950s, B.F. Skinner updated the teaching machine technology. Skinner's machine required users to compose responses in the form of words and phrases. Thus, instead of multiple choice questions, users were presented with more short answer and fill-in-the-blank questions. The machine provided reinforcement for responses that were close to the correct answer, such that the user would be prompted with more questions and eventually reach the desired answer or behavior. This approach allowed users to progress through a unit at their own pace, self-checking along the way, and advancing only after answering correctly. This effectively chunked larger units of instruction into smaller, manageable chunks of instruction for students. This is similar to the functions available in many learning management systems today that allow instructors to place restrictions on assignments such that students must achieve a certain score on a previous assignment before progressing through the unit. In its earliest stages in the 1950s and 1960s, computer-assisted instruction was handicapped by the limitations of the technology of the time. The combination of government funding for military training and breakthroughs in computing technology provided a platform for computer-assisted instruction to infiltrate the K-12 and higher ed sectors in the 1980s. Due to the continued funding of research by the U.S. military for training purposes, computer-assisted instruction has evolved from the simplistic functions of drill and practice and electronic page turning into the modern-day computer-assisted instruction tools of the 21st century. Examples of such tools include learning management systems, MathXL, Late Night Labs, Respondus, and ExamView. Being that behaviorism was the first theory of human learning to develop into a field of research within academia, there have been many criticisms of the theory over the years, and in many instances, rightfully so. Modern-day learning theories promote the learner as an active participant in knowledge construction and focus heavily on the cognitive processing that takes place throughout the learning process. Behaviorism, on the other hand, views the learner as a passive recipient of information and thus promotes a very teacher-centered pedagogy. In the coming chapters, we will see in more depth how the theories that followed behaviorism view the student as an active participant in the learning process and place more emphasis on mental processing. Harasim briefly mentions a critique of Skinner's work on behaviorism by Noam Chomsky on page 38. In reality, the debate between Skinner and Chomsky, which concentrated mostly on the acquisition of verbal and linguistic skills, is perhaps one of the most influential in the field of educational psychology. In his review of Skinner's book, titled Verbal Behavior, Chomsky noted that much of Skinner's empirical evidence was inconclusive. Further, Chomsky suggested that Skinner relied heavily on psychological fallacies throughout his research efforts. Advocates of Skinner's work will be quick to point out that much of Chomsky's critique can be relegated to armchair psychology, truisms, and that Chomsky himself had zero empirical evidence to back any of his own claims or any of his critiques of Skinner. In this chapter, we are introduced to the earliest theory of learning, behaviorism. The most fundamental element of this theory is that learning is viewed as a change in behavior resulting from responses to stimuli. The study of behaviorism has allowed academics to refine the theories of classical and operant conditioning. The use of learning objectives is viewed by many as a direct result of the study of behaviorism. Further, many pedagogical strategies and classroom management techniques have their roots in behaviorism as well. Perhaps most importantly to note in the context of this course is a quote from the author of our text on page 43, in which Harasim states that instructional technology itself has its roots in behaviorism. Suffice it to say that educational theory and educational practice would not be what they are today without it.